A woman who looked homeless was mocked for withdrawing $1,000. Moments later, she shocked everyone by requesting $100 million. She walked into the bank on an ordinary morning, wearing worn jeans and carrying only a baby in her arms. By the time she reached the counter, the glances had already turned into quiet whispers. Some saw only a homeless woman, maybe here to cash a small check. What no one knew was that a life-changing reveal was about to turn every assumption upside down. Hey friends, welcome back to Cracks of Light. Here we share powerful, heart-touching stories that remind us kindness, courage, and hope are still alive in the world. If you want to help us bring more of these meaningful stories to life, please hit subscribe and turn on the bell. Your support gives us the motivation to keep sharing light with the world. This is more than an inspirational story. It's about breaking prejudice, seeing the true human value beyond appearances, and the courage of strong women who rise from hardship. You'll witness the silent endurance of someone underestimated her whole life, the moments of kindness that break through coldness, and a public turning point that leaves an entire room in awe. Can wealth and humility live in the same heart? Can one unexpected twist change how a whole community treats others? If you believe in dignity, resilience, diversity, and equality, and the ripple effect of compassion, this life-changing moment will stay with you long after the credits roll. The morning sun spilled over Cedar Grove's Main Street, painting the rows of boutique shops and brick-front cafes in warm gold. Friday mornings here always had a certain rhythm, fresh coffee aromas drifting from the diner, the sound of polished dress shoes clicking against clean sidewalks, and the constant hum of polite conversation between business owners and their clients. Cedar Grove was small, but its wealth was worn like a well-fitted coat, subtle in some corners, loud in others. At the heart of downtown stood Cedar Grove First National Bank, its sandstone facade and tall glass doors exuding the quiet confidence of an institution that had served the town's elite for generations. The brass handles gleamed from daily polishing. Inside, the marble floors reflected the soft light of hanging chandeliers. Clients here didn't rush. They arrived with purpose, often dressed in pressed suits or tailored dresses, chatting with tellers who knew their families, their investments, and their favorite golf courses. That morning, the lobby was comfortably busy. A retired lawyer leaned on his cane while signing paperwork with a personal banker. Two real estate agents in sharp blazers compared notes on recent sales while waiting for the notary. Near the far window, a young man in a slim-fit suit scrolled through market updates on his phone, sipping espresso from a to-go cup. It was, in every way, an ordinary Friday for Cedar Grove's wealthiest citizens. The doors swung open and a new figure entered, disrupting the unspoken harmony. Eleanor Ellie Matthews stepped in, the cool blast of air conditioning brushing against her cheeks. She wore faded jeans and a cardigan that had seen years of careful washing. A navy blue sling wrapped across her chest cradled a sleeping baby, the child's tiny hand curled near her collarbone. In her left hand, she clutched an aged leather checkbook, edges worn and soft from use, and her driver's license tucked loosely between the pages. Ellie paused just inside, letting her eyes adjust to the dimmer light. She didn't miss the subtle shifts in the room. Conversation slowed, glances flickered in her direction. A boutique owner in a cream silk blouse tilted her head, eyeing the frayed hem of Ellie's cardigan. An older gentleman's eyes dropped to her sneakers, scuffed, practical, not the gleaming leather loafers that seemed standard here. Even the young man with the espresso let his gaze linger a second too long before returning to his phone. By the service counter, Karen Whitley's voice sliced through the murmur. "Oh dear," she whispered to her friend, though loud enough for anyone nearby to catch. Someone must have wandered into the wrong branch. Karen's blonde hair was swept into a glossy chignon, her pearl earrings glinting under the chandelier. She was dressed in a cream pantsuit that matched her designer tote, and her heels made soft, decisive clicks on the marble floor. Her companion gave a polite, almost bored smile. The kind people offer when they're unsure whether to laugh or feign sympathy. Ellie kept walking, each step measured, steady. She moved past a row of cushioned chairs where two retirees sat discussing golf tee times. The older of the two raised an eyebrow at her, the way someone might if they saw a pickup truck parked in front of a country club. At the teller counter, Tom Grant looked up from his computer. Tom was in his late 20s, with neatly combed hair and a tie that perfectly matched the corporate navy of the bank's branding. His smile was quick, rehearsed, and didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good morning," he said in a tone that balanced professionalism with a hint of curiosity. "Can I help you with something today?" "Yes," Ellie replied, adjusting the baby's sling slightly. "I'd like to withdraw $1,000, please." Her voice was calm, even. Tom glanced at the checkbook in her hand, then at the baby, then back to her face. "Of course," he said, but the curve of his mouth shifted, just enough for her to notice. It wasn't unkind exactly, but it was the sort of smile people give when they believe they already understand your situation. He tapped a few keys on his keyboard, then leaned slightly toward the teller beside him, a brunette named Marissa. "Private client branch," he murmured, the words slipping out like a shared joke. Marissa gave a small shrug without looking up from her work. Ellie heard it. She didn't flinch, but her grip on the checkbook tightened slightly. The baby stirred, letting out a small sigh before settling again. Tom looked back at her. "May I see your ID?" Ellie handed it over without hesitation. Her driver's license was worn at the edges, the plastic slightly clouded from years in a crowded wallet. Tom glanced at it, typed something into the system, and continued with the transaction, his fingers tapping with practiced ease. From her spot in line at the next counter, Karen was watching. She leaned closer to her friend. "I'll bet she's cashing some kind of assistance check," she said quietly, the words laced with sugar, but sharpened with condescension. Ellie pretended not to hear. Her eyes drifted to the tall windows, where sunlight streamed through, cutting the marble floor into neat rectangles of gold. She had been in rooms like this before, rooms where everything gleamed, and everyone looked at you as if measuring your worth in invisible currency. The truth was, she had expected it. Cedar Grove had always been like this. Warm handshakes and easy smiles for those who belonged, cool civility for everyone else. She knew the unspoken rules, and she also knew how quickly they could crumble. She was here to test something, though no one in the room could have guessed what. Ellie slid the worn checkbook and her driver's license across the polished counter with a steady hand. The motion was unhurried, deliberate, as if she'd done this hundreds of times before. The faint scent of baby lotion clung to her cardigan, mingling with the cool, sterile aroma of the bank's air-conditioned lobby. Tom accepted the items, still wearing that faint, patronizing half-smile, and began typing her account number into the system. The rhythmic tapping of the keyboard echoed softly between them, punctuated by the distant murmur of conversations across the room. He didn't expect anything unusual. Maybe a balance of a few $100s, perhaps a small inheritance. But then the numbers appeared on his monitor, and his posture shifted almost imperceptibly. His smirk evaporated. He blinked once, twice, as if the screen might be playing tricks on him. The figure stared back at him in stark black font. $67,000 screen. For a moment, Tom's mind went completely blank. He was trained for composure, drilled to keep a neutral expression no matter what appeared on the screen, but this was different. His throat felt dry. He glanced toward Marissa at the next station, then quickly averted his gaze, unsure if he should even breathe too loudly. Without meeting Ellie's eyes, he reached for the small intercom button beneath his counter. "Richard, could you step over here a moment?" His voice was low, controlled, but carried a weight that made the branch manager look up from across the lobby. Richard Halloway was a tall, silver-haired man in his late 50s. He moved with the calm authority of someone used to dealing with high-profile clients, yet there was a noticeable quickness in his stride as he crossed the room. When he reached Tom's station, Tom angled the monitor toward him. Richard leaned forward, scanning the display. His sharp eyes widened just enough for Ellie to notice. The color drained from his face, leaving only a polite mask in place. Slowly, he straightened, smoothing his tie. "Mrs. Matthews," he said, the formal address arriving as suddenly as the respect in his tone, "would you mind joining us in our private client lounge? We can ensure you have a more comfortable experience while we process your request." Ellie regarded him quietly. The sudden shift in demeanor wasn't lost on her. Just minutes ago, she'd been ma'am, greeted with the restrained courtesy reserved for strangers. Now she was Mrs. Matthews, a name spoken with the kind of deference reserved for those whose signatures carried weight. Before she could answer, a voice cut in from a few feet away. Karen Whitley, having overheard the exchange, let out a soft, incredulous laugh. "Don't tell me she's one of your priority customers," she said, loud enough for half the lobby to hear. The sarcasm dripped from every word, her disbelief tangled with a need to perform for the audience she imagined was watching. Ellie's gaze flicked briefly toward Karen, then back to Richard. "I'm fine right here," she said evenly, her voice carrying farther than she intended. "I have nothing to hide." A hush seemed to ripple outward from her words. Clients who had been busy with their own transactions now found themselves turning slightly, pretending to check their watches or shuffle papers, but really leaning into the drama unfolding before them. The sound of the air conditioning filled the silence where conversation had been. Richard hesitated, clearly unused to having a high-value client refuse the sanctuary of the private lounge. He glanced toward the far corner, where the frosted glass doors of the lounge promised privacy, leather seating, and a tray of sparkling water bottles. But Ellie didn't move. Tom cleared his throat softly, his hands hovering over the keyboard. "Of course, Mrs. Matthews," he murmured, adjusting to her choice. He resumed typing, each keystroke feeling heavier than the last. He could sense the shift in the room, the way people's eyes lingered on her a little longer now, confusion mixing with curiosity. Karen's friend leaned in to whisper something to her, but Karen waved her off, her expression still locked on Ellie. The disbelief was still there, but now it was tinged with something else, wariness, maybe even the faintest trace of doubt. Ellie adjusted the baby sling, her hand resting gently over her daughter's back. She could feel the small, steady breaths of the child against her chest, the soothing weight that anchored her in moments like these. In her peripheral vision, she saw the gleam of the marble floor, the faint reflection of her own figure, framed by the high ceilings and polished counters. She felt the weight of the room's scrutiny, but it rolled off her like rain on a well-worn coat. Richard finally nodded, his voice smoother now, though just as deliberate. "We'll proceed as you wish, Mrs. Matthews." Ellie gave a single, polite nod in return. She didn't need their lounge or their filtered water. What she wanted was to stand exactly where everyone could see her, even if they didn't yet understand why. Tom cleared his throat, eyes pinned to the screen, as if the numbers might change if he stared hard enough. "There seems to be, one moment, please?" He straightened his tie with nervous fingers and clicked through a series of tabs he didn't need, the way people retrace their steps when they've misplaced their certainty. "Sometimes our system caches a previous balance," he said to no one in particular, as if explaining his own disbelief to the air. "I'll just refresh." Ellie rocked her daughter with an easy rhythm, a thumb rubbing small circles along the baby's back. She didn't look at the screen. She didn't need to. The baby sighed in her sleep, lips fluttering. Ellie smiled at the sound, as if it were the only thing that mattered in the room. Marissa glanced over, catching the edge of Tom's monitor. Her brows climbed before she managed to look busy again, eyes flicking to the printer, as if paper could hold her attention better than a revelation. Richard returned to the counter with a clipboard he hadn't needed in years. Professional, composed, the face of policy and procedure. "Mrs. Matthews," he began, a calm baritone that had smoothed 100 client nerves. "These sorts of withdrawals, anything of significant magnitude, require coordination. For your safety and for the bank's." Tom's fingers hovered. He swallowed. "Ma'am, Mrs. Matthews, would you prefer to?" "Actually," Ellie said. Her voice cut the hush like a clean blade. Every sound in the lobby rearranged itself around her words. The young man with the espresso stopped scrolling. The retiree's golf course faded into silence. At the far window, a notary's pen paused above a dotted line. "I've changed my mind," Ellie said, still gentle, still even. "I'd like to withdraw everything today." The word hung there, heavier than any briefcase in the room. Everything. A pen slid from the older man's hand and clacked against the floor, the sharp little echo ricocheting off marble and glass. Karen turned fully around, her heels making two clipped notes as if punctuating her disbelief. "You can't be serious," she said, laughing with the bright, brittle sound people use when they're nervous that the joke might be on them. Richard blinked. "Mrs. Matthews." There are federal reporting requirements, and an amount of that size would need a coordinated... That's fine, Ellie said. I can wait. Tom's throat worked. He looked like he wanted to apologize for his own existence. The cursor on his screen blinked, steady and relentless. He tapped a key, then stopped, and then tapped again. He was breathing too loudly. Of course, Richard said, regrouping. Of course. We'll initiate the process immediately. He turned slightly, projecting calm to the room at large. Everyone, we may have a brief delay at this station while we complete a special request. Please feel free to take a seat, and we'll be right with you. A few people pretended to shrug it off, but most didn't move. The lobby's attention tunneled, narrowing down to Ellie's corner, as if someone had pushed in the zoom on a camera lens. The chandelier hummed softly, a faint electrical sound you could only hear if you stopped talking. Now, everyone had stopped talking. Karen slid closer, not close enough to be rude, but close enough to eavesdrop without effort. Everything, she repeated under her breath, tasting the word. Well, that's new. The security guard, Marty, whose usual job was smiling at regulars and pointing tourists to the restroom, stood a little straighter. He wasn't sure if he was supposed to. His hand hovered near the radio clipped to his belt, thumb resting on the push-to-talk as if pressing it might make instructions appear like magic. Richard began to move. He moved like a general in a quiet war, a nod to the assistant manager, a low-voiced directive to the back office, a flick of fingers to the head teller who knew which numbers to call and what codes to use. Initiate a type 3, he said softly, the words clicking into place like tumblers in a lock. Regional first. Let's get corporate on standby. And notify Armadillo. Armadillo? Tom echoed. The armored service, Richard said without breaking stride. Now. He was already dialing before he finished the sentence, walking as he spoke, voice a careful blend of urgency and respect. Hi, yes, this is Cedar Grove First National. Branch 2114. We need immediate dispatch. Yes, that magnitude. 2 units, minimum. Police liaison on the call sheet? Perfect. Thank you. He ended the call, and almost immediately another line lit up. Regional office. He stepped toward the frosted glass of the private client lounge, as if a few feet of distance might make the conversation invisible. Through the glass, you could see a tray of untouched sparkling waters catching the light like gems. He didn't go in. Ellie adjusted the sling with one hand and then placed the other flat on the cool counter. If there are forms to sign, she said to Tom, bring them here. Tom nodded so quickly it looked like a bow. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Matthews. He fumbled with a drawer, producing a stack of forms that were equal parts legalese and ritual. The kind of papers designed to prove everyone had agreed to something no one fully understood. Karen tipped her head. You know, if you wanted attention, there are easier ways. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. A charity gala, for instance. Ellie didn't look at her. I'm not here for attention. Then what are you here for? Karen asked, and there wasn't venom in it, just the practiced curiosity of someone who'd been taught that stories are currency and gossip is the bank where you deposit it. To see, Ellie said. To see what? How people behave, Ellie said simply. When they think no one's watching. Karen looked like she might say something clever and cutting. Then, surprisingly, she didn't. She pressed her lips together and turned to her friend, speaking in a voice too low for anyone to hear. The lobby took a breath, and then another. The printer near Marissa's station began to whir and spit out paperwork for other customers. Fingers tapped phone screens. Someone coughed. It felt like the town itself was hovering, waiting to see whether its reflection in the bank's polished surfaces would turn out flattering or cruel. Marty, the guard, shifted his weight and walked to the front doors, peering through the glass as if armored trucks might materialize from thin air. Outside, Cedar Grove continued its Friday ritual, coffee runs, stroller walks, a landscaper unloading neatly rolled sod from a pickup. The world had not stopped for the bank's revelation. It never did. Richard finished one call only to begin another. He spoke to someone at corporate who said all the things that people at corporate always say. Compliance, risk, timing, verification. Yes, he said, we'll proceed in lobby at client request. His tone warned no one to object. Tom slid the first form toward Ellie. Acknowledgement of the nature of the transaction, he said, choosing words with a care that bordered on reverence. It confirms that you understand the risks involved in handling cash. Everything involves risk, Ellie said lightly, reaching for the pen. Her handwriting flowed, not rapid but confident, the kind of script you develop writing notes to yourself in dark kitchens at 3 a.m. when the baby won't sleep. She signed the second form and the third. If you need another signature, she added, passing the pen back, I'll be here. She remained standing, the baby a warm, breathing weight against her. The counter's edge pressed into her hip. A fold of her cardigan caught on the brushed metal, and she gently freed it with nimble fingers, the way you untangle a necklace chain without losing your patience. The retirees watched this small act as if it meant something. Maybe it did. From the corner near the notary, a woman in a navy blazer, Emma, who ran the local community pantry, lifted a hand slightly. "Do you need water?" she asked softly. "Or a chair?" Ellie smiled at her. "Thank you. I'm okay." Emma nodded, and in that nod was a kind of allegiance, quiet and unannounced, the way real kindness tends to arrive. Karen's phone lit with a text. She glanced at the screen, then at Ellie, then at Richard, who was now coordinating with the town police. The word armored reached her, and the corners of her mouth twitched in disbelief that was quickly losing ground to comprehension. What's happening? The young man with the espresso asked no one, which is how people ask everyone. Nothing, Karen's friend said, meaning everything. The longer the room stayed in this suspended state, the more visible it became. The recalibration of posture, the slow bending of certainty, the way assumptions loosen when they are forced to make space for facts. Tom printed a receipt he didn't need to print, and then handed it to Ellie like an offering. She took it, glanced at it, and placed it neatly beside the stack of signed pages. On the wall behind the counter, a flat screen looped a video about the bank's community initiatives, clips of ribbon cuttings and scholarship awards, shots of smiling families, and high school seniors with oversized checks. The mute captions promised commitment to Cedar Grove. People watched the flickering images without seeing them. "Armadillo's 5 out?" Richard said to Marty in a low voice as he returned to the counter. "PD is coordinating traffic. We'll keep the vestibule clear." Marty nodded and clicked his radio. Copy. Emma, still nearby, checked the baby with a worried glance. "She's sleeping through all this?" "She is," Ellie said, looking down at the tiny face tucked against her. "She always sleeps when she knows I need both hands." "That's a good baby," Emma said and smiled. Ellie's gaze traveled across the room, to Tom's careful posture, to Marissa's steady attention, to Karen's restless fingers tracing the seam of her designer tote. She saw fear and embarrassment, skepticism and dawning humility. She noticed the older man who had dropped his pen earlier, now stooping to pick it up with shaky hands, the metal clicking softly against the marble as if apologizing for having made a scene. Richard's phone buzzed on the counter. He answered and nodded as he listened. "Understood," he said. "Yes, we'll be ready." He hung up and looked to Ellie, his composure returned to its habitual setting. "Mrs. Matthews, the armored vehicles are en route. They'll stage out front momentarily. We will coordinate with law enforcement for a secure transfer." "Thank you," Ellie said. "If you would prefer, I would prefer to remain right here," she repeated. No edge in the words, just fact. I want everything done in the open. Richard's jaw flexed, but he didn't argue. "As you wish." There was a commotion just outside, the sound of tires rolling slow over curbside gravel, followed by the muted squeak of brakes and the distinct heaviness of reinforced doors. Heads turned as a matte gray truck slid into view through the glass doors, bold white lettering stenciled along its side. A second truck eased to a stop behind the first. A patrol car took position at the curb, lights flashing a calm blue-red that painted the bank's ceiling in alternating waves. The effect on the lobby was immediate. Even those who had been pretending not to watch were now openly staring. A woman near the entrance put a hand to her throat as if steadying her pulse. Someone else whispered, "Oh my God," and for once the phrase sounded like its original meaning rather than filler. Marty moved to the doors and opened them to admit the first pair from the armored team. 2 figures in standard-issue uniforms, purposeful but not theatrical. They spoke to him, all business, then to Richard, whose nods grew smaller and more precise. The bank director, a man whose suit cost more than some people's monthly rent, hurried in behind them, cheeks flushed, tie slightly askew as though he donned it in the car. He offered Richard a tight handshake and then turned, scanning the lobby with a polite smile that looked stapled on. "Good morning," the director said, projecting, but not too loudly. "We apologize for any inconvenience. We're working to ensure everything proceeds safely and efficiently." His gaze landed on Ellie, and the smile softened into something real. "Mrs. Matthews, thank you for your patience." Ellie nodded once. Outside, a second patrol car arrived to redirect traffic. Downtown pedestrians slowed, curiosity drawing them toward the bank's facade. Within minutes, a pair of local reporters rolled up with cameras, one holding a mic with the station's logo, hair impeccably set. They stayed on the sidewalk, lenses peering through the glass like new eyes. "Is this really happening?" the espresso man whispered. "It is," Emma said, barely above a breath. It was happening. The lobby reflected it back in small ways. The way people stood straighter, the way murmurs folded into silence, the way a town watched itself being watched and decided to be on its best behavior. Ellie remained the still point around which all the motion revolved. She didn't gloat. She didn't hurry them. She just kept that soft rhythm with the baby, a sway you could only see if you were looking for it. Tom slid another form toward her, hands steady now, as if the ritual of paperwork allowed him a second chance to be the person he wished he'd been at the start. "This one confirms the method of transport," he said, meeting her eyes for the first time with something that looked like respect. Ellie signed. The ink dried in a quiet second. Through the glass, the camera light blinked on. A tiny red dot that told the world it was time to pay attention. The bank director inhaled, shoulders setting, and Richard moved into place with the armored team, ready to execute a plan born of policies no one in the lobby had ever expected to see enforced. And at the center of it, Ellie Matthews stood at the public counter of the private client branch, a woman in a worn cardigan and sneakers, rocking her child and looking straight at the same faces that had measured her when she walked in. She did not look away. The sound arrived before the man did, a new cadence in a room already tuned to every tremor. The armored truck's diesel idle, the click of radios, the hush of a lobby holding its breath. All of it shifted as the front doors opened, and someone walked in, as if the place had been built around his stride. "Mr. Hayes," Richard said, which was technically a greeting, but sounded more like a prayer. Samuel Hayes wasn't the tallest man in the room, but he took the air with him when he moved. Mid-60s, with a clean-shaven jaw and a full head of pewter hair, he wore a suit whose lines fell as if gravity had agreed to cooperate. His tie was simple, his wedding band dull with years. He took in the lobby in a slow glance, noting the armored team, the police lights washing color over marble, the reporters on the sidewalk, and finally the woman at the counter with a sleeping child against her chest. He smiled before he reached her. It was not the public smile newspapers captured at ribbon cuttings. It was the one that lived in photo albums, soft around the eyes, a little weary, fully human. "Ellie," he said, and the name landed like a stone in a still pond. "I wish you'd told me you were coming." The whispers evaporated, sucked out of the room by a vacuum of comprehension. Tom's eyes jerked from the monitor to Samuel and back to Ellie. Karen's mouth opened on a word that never found its way out. Even the bank director, a man unflappable by profession, stilled. Samuel stopped an arm's length from Ellie, mindful not to jostle the baby. He looked down and softened even more. "She's bigger," he said, nodding at the small bundle. "Last time I saw her, she fit in the crook of my palm." Ellie's mouth quirked. "They do that," she said. "Grow." His eyes flicked to the stack of forms, to Richard, to the armored team leader, waiting with a clipboard. Samuel exhaled through his nose, then lifted his chin toward the staff without taking his gaze off Ellie. When he finally turned, he addressed the room with the measured tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed, but not eager to lean on the fact. "She's family," he said simply, "and one of the most important depositors we have." There was no fanfare in it. He said it the way you tell the time. Yet the effect was anything but mundane. Tom's shoulders dropped a fraction, the rigid line of his spine conceding a truth he'd resisted when it arrived in the form of a worn cardigan and sneakers. Karen closed her eyes for a moment. Not dramatic, just long enough to catalog the temperature of her own mortification, and then opened them again to find a room she didn't recognize as reliably as she once had. Richard, to his credit, didn't flinch. He inclined his head, an acknowledgement that was part apology, part pledge. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "we're proceeding per client request, in lobby." Samuel nodded once. "Good." He looked back at Ellie. "You sure you don't want the lounge?" "It's quieter, I'm sure," Ellie said. "I want them to see." He didn't ask who them was. He didn't need to. He shifted so that his shoulder was aligned with hers, as if, without verbalizing it, he'd taken her side publicly, literally. Tom found his voice first. "Mrs. Matthews," he said, and then paused, because the formality felt like a moat built to ward off his own regret. "Ellie," he corrected, voice lower. I'm sorry for how I sounded when you walked in." His ears flushed as he said it. It was not the elaborate apology of a man practiced at absolving himself. It was short and true and cost him something to give. Ellie didn't make him crawl. "Thank you," she said. "I accept that." Tom nodded, relief washing over his features in small, unspooling ways. He busied himself lining up the forms, aligning papers until the edges were a perfect stack, because order is what you reach for when your certainty collapses. Karen's heels made a small sound as she took a step forward, then another. She stopped a respectful distance away, as if approaching a hospital bed. Her voice, when it came, wasn't honeyed or precise. It was just careful. "I'm sorry," she said, the words heavier than she expected. Her face had lost its bright, camera-ready arrangement. She looked like a person for the first time that day. "That was unkind of me." She faltered, searching for a reason that didn't sound like an excuse. "I forget, sometimes, that my voice carries." "So does mine," Ellie said. She adjusted her daughter's sling. A tiny fist had emerged and was absently patting the fabric near Ellie's collarbone. "That's why I chose to speak here." Karen held her gaze and nodded, a fraction of a bow that could have read as theater if her eyes hadn't been that specific shade of sorry. "If there's anything I can do," she said, and stopped again because she heard how empty it sounded. "There will be," Ellie said softly. "Just not for me." Something unlocked in Karen's face. She didn't know what there will be meant yet, but she knew it was more than a favor to wipe a conscience clean. She exhaled, a piece of tension leaving her jaw. "Okay," she said. "Okay." Richard approached with the armored team leader, a woman named Alvarez, whose competence raised the room's IQ simply by existing in it. Alvarez outlined the steps quickly. Verification, staging, secure handoff. She spoke to Ellie as she would to any high-value client, which is to say not like a child and not like a celebrity. "We can proceed now, Mrs. Matthews," Alvarez concluded. "We'll establish a secure perimeter between the teller counter and the vestibule. Police will control entry and exit. We'll make sure you're not crowded." "Thank you," Ellie said. Samuel lifted a hand. "Hold a moment," he said, eyes on Richard. "Before we do anything else, I want to address the way my niece was received." He turned slightly so that his words included the staff and the clients still pretending not to listen. "This bank has a reputation for discretion and excellence. Neither of those require arrogance. If a person walks in wearing boots or heels, carrying a baby or a briefcase, they are owed the same baseline dignity. We don't calibrate courtesy to the price of a suit." The bank director cleared his throat. "Of course, Mr. Hayes. We'll be revisiting training," Samuel said, cutting gently but firmly. "Not a webinar, not a memo. I mean in person, with stories, the kind that stick." Richard didn't bristle. He nodded, and the nod was genuine. "Yes, sir," he said. "I'll coordinate." He faced Ellie. "Mrs. Matthews, Ellie." He swallowed and then let the words land. "I'm sorry." His voice was steady and softer than it had been. The apology carried on a current of something like respect. "I allowed the tone of this room to be set by assumption. That's on me." Ellie studied him for a beat. "Thank you," she said again, and it wasn't perfunctory. Outside, the reporter's cameraman adjusted his angle to catch the reflection of the lobby in the glass doors. Polished marble, people standing like punctuation marks at a sentence they hadn't read closely enough. The police officer at the curb stepped to the side as a third vehicle arrived, this one unmarked, the kind that never needed to flash a badge because its very silence was a credential. "Ma'am?" Alvarez said quietly to Ellie, "We're ready when you are." Ellie's eyes drifted over the room. The tellers, the director, the clients, Karen's careful stance, Emma's small, encouraging smile, Tom's contrition, Marty's earnest posture near the doors. She took a breath that seemed to gather all of it. "Proceed," she said. They did. Alvarez's team moved like a practiced duet, one placing a portable counting unit on a rolling table, the other conferring with Richard about log entries. Tom stepped back from the counter to give Ellie space while still staying close enough to be useful. Forms changed hands. Document sleeves clicked. The choreography of finance unfolded in full view of a town that had rarely seen its mechanics exposed. Every so often, someone's gaze returned to Samuel, as if trying to triangulate this new map of their community. Samuel wasn't grandstanding. He stood next to Ellie with his hands in his pockets, watching the work with the alertness of a man who'd built a life on understanding the difference between show and substance. When he caught Richard's eye, he gave the smallest nod and received one back. It wasn't absolution, but it was a bridge. Karen's phone buzzed. She glanced at a text from a group chat she would never again read the same way. At the bank? Someone had typed. "What's the scandal?" She typed, then hesitated, then deleted what she'd written. For the first time in a long time, she decided that not every moment merited broadcast. She slipped the phone into her bag without responding and looked up as the baby stirred. The child blinked awake, eyes dark and unfocused, mouth forming a perfect O of newness. She yawned, a tiny, squeaking thing that made half the room exhale involuntarily, like a wave had broken gently over an anxious shore. Ellie kissed the top of her daughter's head, the gesture so natural and ordinary that it anchored the moment when everything else felt surreal. "Hey, Star," Ellie murmured. "Almost done." A stack of crisp bills, stage money for verification, a ceremonial token relative to an inconceivable number, clicked under the counter. The sound was unmistakable, and yet less interesting than the changed tone of the hands that counted it. Marissa, who had been quiet through most of it, turned to Ellie. "Do you need a second chair?" she asked. "For your bag?" Ellie shook her head. "I'm good. But thanks for asking." Something unlooked for passed across Marissa's face. Relief, maybe, at having found one thing she could do in a room that made everyone aware of their smallest movements. The older man who had dropped his pen earlier edged closer, his cane tapping lightly in front of him. "Mrs. Matthews," he said, voice tentative. "I don't mean to intrude. I've been a lawyer a long time. I've seen people weigh what to carry and what to put down." He gestured vaguely toward the armored trucks outside. This is a lot to carry. I hope you have people to help you carry it." Ellie met his gaze with something that was almost a smile. "I do," she said, tipping her head toward Samuel, "and some of them remember to ask for directions." The man chuckled, unexpectedly delighted to be included in a moment that felt like permission to be vulnerable without surrendering dignity. He dipped his head and shuffled back to his seat. Richard reappeared at the counter, frictionless now in his movements. "We're on schedule," he said to Samuel, who nodded. Then to Ellie. "Once the last verification is logged, we'll be prepared to execute the transfer." Ellie looked at him for a long moment, then at Alvarez, then out the doors where the police lights continued their patient spin. She breathed in and out, absorbing the geometry of the scene she had chosen. People had seen what they'd needed to see. The armored trucks, the bank's scramble to accommodate what it had not anticipated, the way a woman in a worn cardigan could transform a room without raising her voice. Karen took a step closer again, almost shy. "I host a scholarship gala every spring," she said, the words stumbling at first until they found a path. "We pick students to fund. It's very curated." She winced at her own choice of word. "That's not a compliment. I mean, it's always the valedictorians with the perfect essays and the right connections. I don't think I realized how much the process reflected the people sitting in the room rather than the town itself." She swallowed. "If you have ideas for how to, I don't know, broaden it, I'd like to listen." Ellie looked at her as if seeing something new she could work with. "We can talk," she said, "but you should know, listening might be the easy part." Karen nodded, eyes bright with something like fear braided with relief. "I can do hard," she whispered, almost to herself. Tom, still hovering, finally allowed himself a question. "Why here?" he asked. "Why now?" Ellie tilted her head. "Because here is where people count other people's worth," she said, "and now is when you weren't ready." He absorbed that like a lesson he wouldn't forget the shape of. He thought about the mornings he'd smirked without noticing he was smirking. The afternoons he'd let his patience hinge on a watch rather than a need. He thought about his mother's hands counting tips at the end of a double shift, and then realized he hadn't thought about that in far too long. He felt it like a heat behind his sternum. Samuel checked his watch and then looked up, catching Ellie's eye as if to ask a question without words. She gave the slightest nod. He turned to Richard. "Let's proceed," he said. Alvarez signaled her team. The choreography tightened. Marty opened the vestibule doors and held them, his palm flat against glass, as if shepherding the town's future through a threshold. The director adjusted his posture and stood aside to let the people who actually did the work do the work. Ellie remained where she was, in the center of the lobby, not as a spectacle, but as a witness. People had assembled here expecting efficiency wrapped in exclusivity. What they were getting was accountability wrapped in humility. Emma moved closer, a thread of community in a room of transactions. When this is over, she said quietly, "If you ever want to stop by the pantry, not as a donor, as a guest, to talk." Sometimes people show up with stories that don't fit on intake forms. Ellie's eyes softened. "I'd like that." The lobby's soundscape settled into a new normal. The low cadence of logistics, the scratch of pens, the distant pulse of tires outside. A few customers quietly slipped out, not in disgust or fear, but in a kind of reverent awareness that they were witnessing something and needed a moment to absorb it alone. Others stayed, drawn by the rare privilege of seeing a community edit itself mid-sentence. Karen edged back, standing beside her friend who had been silent for a stretch unprecedented in their friendship. "Are you okay?" her friend whispered. Karen nodded. I don't know. "I'm changed," she said, and surprised herself by not hating the feeling. Tom printed a final page and placed it on a blue pad, sliding it toward Ellie with precise fingers. She read it, signed, and looked up. Whatever came next, she had already done the thing she came to do. She had held up a mirror. The face looking back at Cedar Grove wasn't ugly, not exactly. It was just unexamined. And now it had a chance. Samuel touched the edge of the counter, a small, steadying contact with the physical world. "We'll talk later," he said to Ellie, an uncle's promise tucked inside a chairman's day. "Not about numbers." "Good," Ellie said. "I've never liked math as much as people think I should." "Funny," he said. "I built a life on it and still never trusted it as much as I trust a story told straight." The armored team began to move toward the vestibule. The director stepped slightly ahead, performing his role not for the cameras now, but for the staff who had taken their cues from him for years. Richard stood to the side, not diminished but quietly recalibrated, a man who had been offered a chance to choose better and was taking it. From the sidewalk, the reporter lifted her mic. "We're here at Cedar Grove First National," she said, voice smooth as new paper. In a remarkable turn, what began as a routine Friday has become a lesson in perception, policy, and the quiet power of one person's insistence on dignity. Inside, no one heard her. The story's heart was beating too loud to require a narrator. The lobby's eyes remained on Ellie, who adjusted her daughter's sling again, pressing a kiss to a soft forehead that smelled faintly of milk and sleep. "Ready?" Alvarez asked gently. Ellie nodded, ready. The signal came like a nod you felt more than saw. Alvarez lifting 2 fingers to her team, the officers outside adjusting their stance, the bank director stepping back to make room. A hush settled again, the kind that happens just before a choir inhales. Ellie rose. "I'm not withdrawing a dime," she said. The sentence landed, simple as a door clicking shut. Several people blinked, as if they'd misheard. Ellie's voice was even, every word clean enough to replay later without the fuzz of confusion. "I came to see how this place treats someone you think has nothing," she continued. "And today, you showed me." A camera light brightened, a pinpoint star reflected in the glass doors. Somewhere outside, a horn bleated once and cut off, like the town had remembered it was supposed to be quiet. Inside, the baby shifted, wide awake now and untroubled. 2 small hands splayed against Ellie's chest, as if anchoring both of them to the moment. She turned to the staff. There was no fury in it, no grand gesture. Just a woman in a worn cardigan and sneakers, speaking like a teacher who believed her students could learn. "From now on," Ellie said, "I hope you treat everyone who walks in here with respect, whether they're wearing a business suit or carrying a baby in a thrift store sweater." A tear slid down Marissa's cheek before she could stop it. She swiped at it quickly and then stopped swiping, letting it be what it was. Tom looked at his hands, then forced himself to look up and meet Ellie's eyes, because that felt like the first right thing he'd done all morning. Karen stared at the floor, jaw tight, as if the marble had grown interesting. The director's nod was small and sincere. Richard's face softened into something almost shy, the expression of a man who has been given a chance to be better and intends to take it. Alvarez lowered her hand. Her team stood down without theatrics, the way professionals do when the plan changes, but the purpose stays. One of the officers at the door turned off his lights. The colors that had been skating across the ceiling faded, leaving the lobby lit by the patient glow of the chandeliers. The reporter outside, sensing the pivot, leaned toward the glass without getting in the way. The cameraman adjusted focus. The little red light stayed on. Samuel took half step closer to Ellie. "You're sure?" he murmured, though he already knew the answer. "I'm sure," she said. "This was never about the money." He nodded. "Then let's make it about what it was about." She looked at him, a flick of gratitude passing between them like a coin palmed from one hand to another without breaking the flow. Richard cleared his throat. "Mrs. Matthews," he began, and stopped long enough to reset. "Ellie, your point has been heard." He angled himself slightly so his words included the staff. "We will redo our training. Not just policies, attitudes." He looked at Tom, then Marissa, then the director, and finally at Marty, who was standing at his post like a promise. "We'll start today." Marty nodded like a vow. "Today?" he echoed. Ellie shifted her daughter, who grabbed a curl of Ellie's hair and held it tight with the concentration only babies bring to simple tasks. A laugh traveled through the lobby, soft, a release valve. People started breathing again like they'd been under a wave and just felt their feet touch sand. Karen lifted her chin. She didn't look at Ellie yet, but she stopped studying the floor. "Mrs. Matthews," she said, and then shook her head at herself. "Ellie, I'm sorry. The word she chose was honest. Cruel." Ellie regarded her, not letting her off the hook and not pushing her off the pier. "You were careless," she said. "But you can care." Karen took that like medicine, a taste she would remember later when she wanted to spit out a reflex and choose a response instead. "I can," she said quietly. "Good," Ellie said. "We'll need you." The reporter tapped her mic against her palm, then seemed to decide something and lowered it again. The story was telling itself just fine without narration. Emma from the pantry stepped forward the way some people step forward at church. Not to be seen, but because staying still would feel like a lie. "I don't know if this matters," she said, "but we've been trying to launch a Saturday listening hour at the pantry. No forms, no intake. Just stories. We keep getting asked who's qualified to come." She smiled at her own absurd sentence. "Everyone is, of course. But some folks need to hear that from a place with marble floors." Richard didn't hesitate. "Use the community room here," he said, surprising even himself. "Saturday mornings. We'll open the side entrance. Coffee's on us." The director looked at him, startled, then at Samuel. Samuel's nod was slow and definitive. "Put it on the calendar," he said, "and not as a PR stunt, as a standing invitation." Karen's head snapped up. She caught Ellie's gaze and held it. "I'll come," she said, the words steady. "To listen, not to speak." Ellie's smile, when it came, was small and true. "That's a good start." Tom stepped closer to the counter. "I found something this morning," he said, voice low, "in myself." He swallowed and didn't dress it up. I didn't like it. He looked at the forms still sitting neatly stacked, the copy paper pristine and dumb. "I thought I was fair because I'm polite." He shook his head once. "I'm going to be better than polite." "Better than polite," Ellie repeated, as if trying the phrase on and finding it fit. A woman near the back, short hair, steel-framed glasses, the kind of face that seems to hold people's secrets without judgment, raised her hand like she was in a classroom. "My name's Denise," she said. "I run HR over at the hospital. We've been revisiting the way we treat walk-ins in the billing office. It's not great." She winced. "If you'll have me on Saturday, I'd like to listen. And then I'd like to hire some of you to come talk to my staff." Emma smiled. "We'll make room." Samuel glanced toward the doors, where the crowd outside had grown, faces pressed softly to the glass. The town's curiosity mixed with something gentler. He spoke quietly, but the room heard him. "If anyone here needs help getting what you need from this bank," he said, "ask for me. And if anyone here wants to help us be what we say we are," he added, "start with the person in front of you in line." The older lawyer with the cane chuckled. That's a policy I can endorse, he said, easing back into his chair, as if the furniture had become kinder too. The baby made a sound that could almost be a laugh. Ellie kissed her hair again. She approves, she said. A murmur of warmth moved through the lobby, the sound of strangers agreeing about something that mattered. Outside, the camera's red light blinked steadily. Inside, the moment kept unfolding in smaller, quieter ways that no lens would catch. Marissa offering Marty a tissue because he'd been blinking too hard. The director loosening his tie half an inch as if it might let more oxygen into his chest. Richard sliding his phone into his pocket with the decisive air of a man who has decided to be reachable for different reasons. Ellie, Karen said, voice steadying. You said, we'll need you. Who's we? Ellie thought for a heartbeat, then another. The town, she said. The part of it that doesn't have a name yet. Karen's eyes shone in a new way. Then I want to be part of that. Then show up on Saturday, Ellie said. And on the days after that when there aren't cameras. Done, Karen said, and it sounded like a promise she'd already put in her calendar. Alvarez, who had been quietly resetting her team's gear, approached Ellie with a small smile. I've stood in a lot of lobbies, she said. This is the first time I've been happy to pack up without lifting a single bag. Ellie nodded, grateful. Thank you for being ready. Anytime, Alvarez said. And for what it's worth, this will travel. People in my line of work talk, not the gossip kind, the remember this for next time kind. Good, Ellie said. Let it. A young teller who had been silent until now, barely out of college, tie a little crooked, eyes earnest, cleared his throat. My mom cleans houses, he said, cheeks flushing as the whole room listened. I've heard how people talk to her sometimes. I thought if I wore this, he tugged lightly at the tie, I wouldn't be like them. He exhaled. Turns out clothes don't do that work. Tom put a hand on the young man's shoulder. We'll do it, he said, together. The young man nodded, jaw tightening in a way that looked like resolve rather than defensiveness. Ellie eased back onto her heels, feeling the ground under her in a way that reached past marble to something steadier. She looked at Samuel. If you're serious about the training, she said, let's make it stories, not slides. Agreed, Samuel said. I'll ask Emma to curate voices, and I'll sit in the first row. You'll sit in the circle, Ellie said. No rows. Circle, he corrected immediately, a grin tugging at his mouth. Circle it is. The director raised a tentative hand. May I suggest, he said carefully, that we name the series? People remember names. Emma nodded. Names matter, she said. What you call something is a kind of first truth. Call it the Cedar Grove Promise, Richard offered, surprising himself again. Short, clear, a pledge. Marty beamed. I like that. Ellie considered it. Promises are only as strong as the days you keep them, she said. Then we'll keep them, Richard replied, and for once it didn't sound like branding, it sounded like a man volunteering for a shift. A new sound joined the lobby's soundscape, a slow clap, one pair of hands finding courage. It came from Denise in the back. She clapped once, twice, 3 times, and then others joined, not the thunder of applause, but the gentle insistence of agreement. It swelled and then softened, like a tide that knows when to pull its foam back into itself. The cameras captured it. More importantly, the room felt it. Ellie held up a hand, and the clapping quieted without anyone feeling shushed. I appreciate that, she said. But I've seen clapping before. It's easy. When you go home, look at your calendars. See where this lives next week. Make space. Saturday, Karen said aloud, as if reminding herself. Listening hour. Saturday, echoed Emma, smiling. And Tuesday, Tom added. Our first Cedar Grove Promise Circle. Break room. No rows. Wednesday, the young teller said, glancing at Richard for permission and getting a nod, I'll shadow intake at the pantry for an hour. Thursday, Denise said, I'll start rewriting the hospital's front desk script. Friday, Marty added, I'll practice saying, welcome in, like I mean it. Every time. Ellie's shoulders eased. That's a week, she said. That's how promises start. The baby squirmed and let out a small complaint, the kind that means hunger more than distress. Ellie checked the time. Life did not pause, even for moments like this. It folded them in and kept going as it should. We're done here, she said gently. Not finished. Just done for today. Richard nodded, understanding both halves of that sentence. He turned to the room. Thank you for your patience, he said. And it was remarkable how different that sentence sounded now that the patience had resulted in something other than faster service. People began to move again, not scattering but flowing. A few came up to Ellie, keeping their words brief and their eyes steady. "Thank you. I'm sorry. I learned something." She accepted each without turning herself into a confessional. This wasn't absolution day. It was a beginning. Karen stepped forward one last time. "I'll email you," she said, then laughed softly at herself. "No, I'll see you Saturday. I'll bring coffee," she grimaced. From the diner, not the place where they judge you for ordering decaf. Ellie's laugh joined hers. "Deal," she said. Outside, the reporter finally lifted her mic, catching the last of the moment for people who would watch it later at their kitchen tables. "What looks like a banking story," she said into the camera, "isn't. It's a community story, and it just found its new chapter." Inside, Ellie settled her daughter a little higher in the sling. Samuel offered his arm, not because she needed it, but because offering is how you practice the muscle you hope becomes reflex. She took it, not because she needed it, but because receiving is also part of the work. They walked toward the doors. The crowd outside parted without anyone having to call for order. As Ellie stepped through, the baby burrowed her face against Ellie's sweater. Soothed by the familiar smell of home that a mother carries with her wherever she goes. The sun was bright, unbothered by what had happened, as suns tend to be. The air held the scent of cut grass and the faint sweetness of something baking 2 blocks over. Cedar Grove continued its Friday. Deliveries to make, lawns to mow, kids to pick up from preschool. But it was not the same town it had been that morning. It was a town that had heard itself speak and decided to change its tone. Ellie paused on the top step. She didn't turn to the cameras, didn't pose. She looked at the sidewalk, at the faces there, curious, embarrassed, moved, stubborn, open. She gave a small nod that meant we can do this. Then she started down the steps with Samuel beside her, one hand on the rail more out of habit than need. Behind her, the bank's doors whispered shut. Inside, staff were already shifting chairs in the break room into a circle. Emma texted a volunteer about Saturday. Denise created a new note in her phone. Front desk script, questions that don't wound. Tom pulled up a calendar invite and titled it Cedar Grove Promise, Week 1. Marty practiced welcome in under his breath and smiled when it finally sounded exactly like he wanted it to. On the street, a little boy on a scooter skidded to a stop, gaping at the armored trucks. "Whoa," he said to no one in particular. "Is there a treasure in there?" Ellie smiled at him. "There's treasure everywhere," she said, "if you know how to see it." He considered this with the seriousness only children and philosophers grant to new ideas. "Okay," he said, and pushed off again, scooter rattling over the cracks in the sidewalk like a drum roll. Samuel glanced at Ellie as they reached the curb. "Lunch?" he asked. "Please," she said, and the word contained the honest hunger of a mother who'd timed her morning around a baby's nap in a town's lesson. They crossed the street together, the world widening again beyond the bank's glass. Cedar Grove watched them go, and then, slowly, returned to itself. With a small, steady difference that would show up in emails and eye contact, in Saturday mornings and break room circles, in the way people answered the phone and greeted the person in front of them. The cameras kept rolling, but the real recording had already begun, the kind that stores in muscle memory and local folklore, in the sentence people say when they need to remind each other who they are. Remember the day at the bank? Let's be like that. By Monday morning, Cedar Grove felt different in ways that were hard to name, but easy to sense. The hum of the town had shifted, like when a piano's been tuned and you can't point to a single note that changed, only that everything sounds more right. The front page of the Cedar Grove Chronicle sold out at every stand before noon. The headline stretched in bold across the top. "Widowed mother tests bank staff, teaches town a lesson on dignity." Below it, a photo of Ellie, caught mid-sentence in the bank's lobby, baby in her arms. Her expression was steady, not defiant, not smug, but anchored. The image pulled you in. Even people who didn't read the article knew exactly what it was about. It wasn't just the Chronicle. The radio station ran the story during their morning commute hour, weaving snippets of interviews with townsfolk. The grocer on Maple Street said she'd seen it coming. The high school custodian admitted he wished he'd had Ellie's courage years ago. By lunchtime, an anonymous envelope arrived at the Cedar Grove Community Pantry. Inside, a cashier's check for $25,000. No name, no return address, just a note written in blocky capital letters, For Ellie. For everyone who needs a hand someday. Emma, who ran the pantry, sat down hard in the nearest chair when she saw it. It didn't stop there. Checks and small bills began arriving daily. Some slipped under the pantry's door overnight, others tucked between cans on the donation shelf. A group of retired teachers pooled their pensions to cover 6 months of fresh produce orders. The mayor's wife sent over 2 industrial freezers, no strings attached. But the real shift wasn't in money. It was in eyes, voices, gestures. At the bank, customers noticed something subtle but undeniable. Every person who walked through those glass doors was greeted with the same warmth, whether they were depositing a 6-figure check or cashing in a jar of quarters. Marty, the security guard, made a point of saying welcome in like he meant it. And by week's end, so did the tellers. Karen, who had once spoken to Ellie like she was in the way, now had a habit of coming out from behind the counter to meet customers halfway. "Can I carry that for you?" She asked a man struggling with a heavy bag of coins. The man blinked, surprised, then let her take it. In the coffee shops, the story came up again and again, sometimes as a moral lesson, sometimes as a confession. "I saw myself in those tellers," one woman admitted to her friend, stirring her cappuccino. And not in a good way. The social clubs felt it too. The Cedar Grove Ladies Auxiliary, known for being polite but impenetrable, voted to open membership without sponsorship for the first time in 50 years. At their next meeting, a school bus driver and a grocery clerk sat at the long, polished table, swapping stories with women whose families had been in town since before the war. At the feed store, 2 old farmers who hadn't spoken in a decade over a boundary dispute were seen talking quietly by the bins of seed corn. "Life's too short," one said, shrugging. "Saw that lady on TV. Made me think." Even the high school took note. Principal Harris called an assembly, telling the students they'd be launching a Respect in Action week. Posters went up with simple messages in bold letters. "Listen first. Speak kindly. Stand up." The ripple reached places Ellie never expected. One morning, as she carried her daughter through the aisles of Harper's grocery, the butcher stepped out from behind the counter. "You don't know me," he said, wiping his hands on his apron, "but I know you." "My wife's been watching the coverage." His voice wavered just enough to make him clear his throat. "She wanted me to say thank you, not for the bank thing, for reminding folks they've got choices in how they treat each other." Ellie smiled. "I didn't plan it," she said. "Doesn't matter," the butcher replied. "You did it." In the diner, old Mr. Roebuck, who'd once turned his back on Ellie when she'd been short 50 cents for her coffee, now stood when she walked in. "Table by the window?" he offered, as if she'd been a regular all along. On the edge of town, the little hardware store started keeping a small account labeled Community Tab. No application, no questions. If someone needed a wrench, batteries, or a space heater in the winter and couldn't pay, the tab covered it. When the owner was asked why, he just said, "Ellie made me think. If the bank can change, so can we." But change wasn't uniform or easy. There were still mutters, at the gas station, in the corner booth of the pub, about making a spectacle or trying to shame good people. And yet, those mutters sounded thinner now, lacking the certainty they once carried. One evening, Ellie found herself in line at the post office behind a man in a suit. Polished shoes, gold cufflinks, everything about him saying important. When he reached the counter, he realized he was short on postage. The clerk, a young man who might have been in his first month on the job, smiled and said, "Don't worry, I've got you." He pulled a stamp from his own roll, slid it across without a fuss. The suited man looked startled. "Thank you," he said, and his voice carried the same note Ellie had heard all week, surprise at being met with kindness where he'd expected calculation. Outside, as she buckled her daughter into the car seat, Ellie overheard 2 teenagers walking past. "You see that bank video?" one asked. "Yeah. My mom made us watch it," the other replied, rolling her eyes. "Said it's how people are supposed to act." Ellie laughed quietly to herself. If mothers were making their kids watch it, something had landed. The town council voted unanimously to sponsor the Cedar Grove Promise gatherings, holding them once a month in the community room at the bank. No rows, just circles. The first one filled every chair, and still people stood along the walls. Farmers in work boots sat beside lawyers in pressed suits, and for once, nobody seemed to notice the difference. Emma opened the meeting with a simple question. What's one thing you can do tomorrow to make someone feel like they belong? A high schooler said she'd start sitting with the new kid at lunch. The mayor said he'd make a point of learning the names of every sanitation worker in town. Karen, yes, that Karen, said she'd stop assuming someone's story based on the way they were dressed. Ellie listened, rocking her baby gently, not needing to speak. The words were moving without her now. By the second month, the promised circles had doubled in size. The local cafe started staying open late on meeting nights, offering free coffee to anyone with a name tag from the event. The library created a community voices shelf where anyone could leave a written account of kindness they'd witnessed. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't magic, but it was movement. And in a small town like Cedar Grove, movement, real, human, unforced, was the kind of news that traveled faster than gossip. Ellie paused just outside the polished glass doors, the crisp air brushing against her cheeks. The maple trees along Main Street were letting go of their last red leaves, the breeze sending them tumbling in lazy spirals to the sidewalk. Samuel lingered beside her, his hands in the pockets of his tailored coat, watching her with quiet pride. She turned back toward the bank, catching the faces still pressed to the windows, tellers, clients, even the security guard. Her voice carried just enough to reach them without strain. Remember, wealth can buy comfort, but kindness can change the world. The words hung there, soft but unshakable, like a note that refuses to fade. She didn't wait for applause or acknowledgement. Some messages are meant to be planted, not answered. The armored truck's heavy doors clanged shut, the metallic echo rolling down the street. Cars passed slowly, their drivers glancing curiously at the sight of the convoy, not knowing the story that had unfolded inside. Ellie shifted her baby in the sling, tucking the blanket closer around her daughter's face. The warmth of that tiny heartbeat against her own grounded her more than any number in a bank account ever could. They walked toward Samuel's car, the hum of Cedar Grove around them. Somewhere down the block, a shopkeeper swept leaves from his doorway. Across the street, a teenager held the door for a woman carrying grocery bags. Small things, but maybe not so small anymore. She knew tomorrow would look like any other. Coffee brewing at dawn, errands to run, bills to pay. But under the surface, something in this town had shifted, and she hoped, with the kind of quiet hope that takes root in the soul, that it would keep shifting. Before getting into the car, Ellie took one more look at the bank. Not with bitterness, not with triumph, just a steady acceptance. People could change. Places could too. As they pulled away, the afternoon sun caught on the windows of the bank, flashing briefly in her rearview mirror. A reminder that even in the most polished of places, there's room for light to break through. And maybe, she thought, this was only the beginning. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you never miss the next story that proves kindness can still surprise the world.